Hi, and welcome to Night Clerk Radio. We're going to be talking about Jet Set Radio, the lost future of a hip-hop utopia, perhaps? Well, I don't know. It was a great Dreamcast game. I do know that much. And it had an amazing soundtrack. And that's what we're going to be talking about, the music and the style and the legacy of Jet Set Radio. Or, as they say, Jet Set Radio!
Can't even do that radio announcer justice. I sure can't.
No, I would not even. It was an homage, but not obviously. The actor they got for that was perfect. So Jet Set Radio was one of the launch titles of the Sega Dreamcast, Sega's last console. And it was a unique intersection of many cultural moments. And I think this episode sort of, again, demonstrates that culture is a conversation. It's all these influences blending together to create something really unique. I played it when it came out, and I played it recently, actually, in preparation for this episode, because it's been re-released on new consoles and for the computer on Steam. And
you had to download a hex editor just to play that game.
Yeah, the port was not that great. And, certainly as a game, it has a great legacy, but it's not without its blemishes, its flaws. So yeah, I'm really eager to dive into this. But Burke, what is sort of your? So I'm a longtime fanboy of Jet Set Radio. Burke, what is sort of your stance on Jet Set?
Yeah, so I never played it, but I watched my friend play it a lot because I was really shit at those 3D type games, any of them. So I was never allowed to play it, but I watched people play it. So I really am familiar with the soundtrack. You just hear it all the time, and I love that style. But I never played the sequel or anything, which is Jet Set Future, right?
Jet Set Radio Future, yeah. I think.
Yeah. Gotta say the whole title.
Yeah, so Jet Set Radio is a game about being a member of the Go-Go's, which are a gang in Tokyo-to, a sort of mythical version of Tokyo. And unlike other gang members who, primarily exist to, survive and make money through crime, the Go-Go's just do inline skating. This is perhaps the coolest depiction of inline skating.
Because you don't have to do anything to do it.
Yeah. It's not like Tony Hawk or other games. You just automatically grind when you jump onto a rail. You have incredible jumping power. You just really fucking sail into the sky when you jump. But they also tag. And this is the first sort of major video game that had graffiti as a gameplay element. And I think that's sort of one of the first things that's really interesting about this game is that the whole game is about defeating violence and greed, because you're fighting other gangs, you're fighting the police. Well, you're not fighting, but you're in conflict with the other gangs, the police, and a criminal syndicate. And you defeat them by literally graffitiing, tagging neighborhoods and other gang members. When you tag them enough, they give up. And you can tag an attack helicopter, multiple attack helicopters that cause them to crash. So even though other characters are shooting at you, trying to punch you, kick you, you only have spray paint as your weapon. That's all you need. And I like this idea of art defeating, the police state.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because it's so weird because you're fighting these other gangs, you're fighting these corrupt cops, and there's the detective character, but then there's also an evil corporation looking for a devil record. It's just such a bizarre fucking game, but I think it's really a classic in terms of those early cell shaded.
It was actually pretty much the first cell shaded game. They talk about how they had to research methods in order to give it a unique look, and they chose cell shading. And it was so influential that's why cell shading became a thing in video games. Borderlands would not look the way it does without this.
Yeah, and they did a really good job with the cell shading to hide the low polygon count and stuff, not to get too into game graphics stuff. Yeah, that stuff's really interesting. This big world they built, which is pitiful by today's standards if you play any modern open world game. But rocketing around these streets and stuff was pretty cool at the time, even though it feels clunky now.
Yeah,
it still really works.
The antagonists are certainly interesting, but for me, this sort of, again, I mentioned, this is sort of a fusion of a bunch of different elements. So you see, the art style, I feel is influenced by a couple of different things, and mostly by Japanese youth culture of the 90s, which is what the art director said. That's what he was looking at when he was making the game, but also to a degree, Japanese pop art and the super flat movement, which if you look at the art of Jet Set Radio and then you look at super flat art, which the most famous artist of that is Takashi Murakami, And his stuff is not safe for work, by the way, especially some of his sculptures. But it's very vivid colors, very flat, very cartoonish, and influenced by anime and manga, but still like not just anime and manga. So it's sort of like the Andy Warhol or the Roy Lichtenstein, but for Japan is sort of like the idea. And you can definitely see that in the art style of Jet Set Radio.
Mm-hmm.
But the music is also all these things that were popular in the 90s. They were sort of put together in a way that makes this music worth listening to, even if you've never played the game, if you have no interest in it, if you've never heard of it before, because it is joyful and it's very fun. It's very energetic. God, it's I think probably an influence of future funk to some degree. Sort of. I mean, you can hear there's certainly major funk element into it and a bit of disco in some of the tracks. And yeah, I've just been listening to the soundtrack quite a bit, and it's like, oh yeah, I fucking love this stuff.
Oh yeah, the soundtrack is great. So many influences. Mm-hmm. Like, just to talk about, like you said, funk, but it pulls from a lot of hip hop at the time, mm-hmm. which was very popular in like Japanese youth culture. God, what else? There's like weird acidy jazz stuff.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of EDM, metal, rock. It's got like a little bit of everything all blended together.
Mm-hmm.
And it sounds, I don't really know, relative to the time, I guess not really, but the way like samples and stuff are cut together like very frenetically,
mm-hmm.
it sounds very modern, even today.
Yeah.
It doesn't sound like dated sampling.
Mm-hmm.
It's very, very ahead of its time, I think, in a lot of ways.
Yeah, it's really sophisticated music, especially for like a video game in the early 2000s, because I mean, Jet Set Radio was a game that showed like I think a whole generation of artists, musicians, and game designers that a game could really just have a vision and stick to it. So like the implementation of the game is very flawed in a lot of ways, but like that's the thing, is they had this unique vision for it and they stuck to it. You didn't have to just rip off or just be a minor variation of like, military shooter, X, or like platformer that's a ripoff of Mario Brothers or Sonic or whatever. You can't really point to a game before Jet Set Radio and say, obviously Jet Set Radio is ripping this off. But you can see a lot of games that have come that are clearly, inspired by Jet Set Radio. There's even a game that's in production right now called Bomb Rush Cyberfunk that is clearly like an homage / spiritual sequel to Jet Set Radio, because after Jet Set Radio Future, the franchise basically was put on ice and like it never made any money. It was always like a cult hit, a niche thing, but still like it was different at the time. It was unique. And I think it's still influencing creators to this day.
Oh, yeah. If you want to talk about some of those influences real quick, like just in games, and then if you want to talk about the soundtrack, we can. But you see tons of games coming out that still have some little tidbit of Jet Set Radio in them. So there's like Concrete Genie, which was a graffiti, kind of like an overworld.
Mm-hmm. The graffiti mechanics in general, that was the first time like people made like, that was what your character did, was go around graffitiing things. Mm-hmm. And then the idea of using like a motion thing, like hit down, then up, and then like it was this pattern you had to work through. But I've seen it in tons of other games, like even like The Warriors, which was released a couple of years later based on the 70s movie. And that was like a sub game you did in that.
That's a weird little circle of inspiration, because I'm sure the eccentric gang stuff of the Warriors probably in their mind when doing Jet Set.
There's definitely a Warrior saying in Jet Set Radio, because all the gangs have like a theme.
Mm-hmm. And there's a central announcer, just like there's a central radio.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, that too.
In Warriors.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And funky music. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Sunset Overdrive was all of the counterculture, like skating around stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Hover was a Kickstarter project that was just straight up like, we're trying to make Jet Set Radio again. So it's all over.
Yeah. And again, cell shading, like as a thing.
Oh, yeah.
A lot of games use it as kind of a way to justify like, oh, we're just being stylized. We just don't want to do the photorealistic thing. But some games pulled off really well. People weren't doing cell shading beforehand. Now they are. So thanks, Jet Set.
So do you want to get into the soundtrack specifically?
Yeah.
Let's do it. that was the iconic main game music. What, main menu music? Is that the gamer term?
That's like the standard music in like menus. Like when you're selecting your character, the humming the bass line is the music you hear as you're like hanging out and going between menus in the game. The music that you hear on the startup of the game, like the first thing you hit is that fucking intro to Let Your Mom Sleep. In fact, why don't we do that? So that was Let Mom Sleep by Hideki Naganuma, who is the composer of the game, did many of the soundtrack. But that 3 seconds, and I guess that's like a turntable sort of like stab. That's what you hear when you boot up the game. That's the one that's ingrained in my head. But the hum your bass line is the one that if you step away from the game, that's the menu music. So like you probably if you had a friend who's playing it would walk away, that would be the music you probably heard a lot more of.
Yes. Yeah, that makes sense. That's burned into my brain. But I think it sets the tone for this whole album, like you said, being very, very upbeat and very energetic. It always feels depressing to say. I always say this stuff feels very pre 9/11.
Oh, 100%.
That was the mood in the 90s.
Yeah. No, well,
we've said again.
It was the 90s were about like personal versus sort of trying to find yourself and being authentic. Like in Japan, youth culture was actually way more interested in hip hop and rap and things that were more seen as more countercultural because Japan had an economic crisis lasting the entire decade. It was like a lost decade for the Japanese youth. And so they were trying to find a new identity compared to the 80s. If you look at the pop music and what the kids were doing back then, Jet Set Radio drew from that a lot. Obviously that's sort of the core of the identity, but like this is totally aside, but you mentioned how like we were watching a bad movie together, The Chronicles of Riddick, and just have this massive civilization getting attacked. It's like, oh yeah, this is obviously an impact on. I was like, and then it took me a second. I was like, oh shit, you're right. But yeah, like you did these existential threats, affecting the entire country. That was not really a thing as much in video games in the 90s and early before 9/11. And this is very much because it's about like, let's fight the cops with graffiti, gang. Like
yeah, get your magnetic rollerblades. We're going graffitiing. Yeah, no, totally. My example for that I always bring up is Halo 1 and 2. Where 1 is just like sci-fi action and 2 is like, oh, the bad guys are actually like this weird religious cult coming to get you. That's odd. It's like, oh, I wonder why we went with that route with our game. So it's so blatant.
So yeah, humming the bass line is probably one of the most chill songs on the soundtrack because it's, I don't want to say this is like sort of a predecessor to lo-fi hip hop, but like this would be the closest to it, right?
Yeah, it still has a bit more structure than I'd want in my lo-fi, I think. But yeah, it's definitely the most relaxed. Everything else is just so funky. All kinds of house beats and stuff.
Yeah. Going back to Let Mom Sleep, I really love that song more because again, that sort of turntable stab, and then followed by the horn section is just fucking perfect. Hideki was a really master of like getting the sort of, it's kind of hard to like exactly nail down the genre of a lot of these because there's like electronic genres in general very kind of gray about what fits in what genre, but like a lot of people have categorized it more as like big beat. So okay, I don't know.
I don't really know all my like EDM subgenres. I remember looking at a big like infographic of them.
So big beat back in the 90s was very big in the like 1995 to 2002 was sort of like the era of big beat. And the big ones are the ones like Fatboy Slim, Chemical Brothers, The Prodigy.
Oh, okay. I just had not ever called them that. I got you.
Yeah. That is like there's rock in it. There's guitar in it. There's that sort of 4/4 structure to it.
So it's just the Matrix soundtrack.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, Propellerheads. That was basically that was another huge thing. That was the heyday of big beat. Okay. And do you get that kind of energy from this album?
Yeah. Now that I know what it is. Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
So I love that music. And when doing research for this episode, it was very disconcerting to find out that like after 2002, basically everyone thought it was cringe, thought it was uncool and dropped it. And there's retrospectives now from like, well, Big Beat isn't as, it's still important in EDM and everyone hates it now. It overstayed its welcome, but like it was still important. It's like, really? Everyone hates propeller heads now? Yeah.
Hey, it's 20 years, man. You can get your nostalgia cycle. Maybe we come back.
Yeah. I mean, that's true. Not everything on here is exactly Big Beat. There's a lot of areas. There's a lot more funk in Jet Set Radio than in Big Beat, because Big Beat is very like rock and like, I don't want to say like macho, but kind of frat bro energy to a degree.
A little.
Yeah. Yeah, if you think about like the Prodigy and like Propeller Heads. And
I very much, just because it was always on pop radio, I very much associate like Fatboy Slim with that group.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Fatboy Slim too.
Just as like, I was too cool for this in high school. This is on DC 101.
Oh no, I definitely was not.
Yeah, but some of my favorite inspiration that you find on this album is a lot of the hip hop stuff. Like there's a lot of really cool drum beats, like really, really sick, like really, really sick syncopated drum beats, like displacing stuff around and grooving. It's just all those influences. They just come together so well. And what struck me about this album is that it feels conceptually like from a top-down approach. It doesn't feel like a video game soundtrack, because we've talked about this in two previous episodes about video games, where the way you write video game music, it has to kind of repeat. It has to be repetitious because you don't know how long they're going to be skating around. And the album does have some of that. Like there are the back 10 minute or so are like melody tracks of just cut up samples of like basically the hits from the album itself. But if you just listen to the first 12 tracks, which are just all the standalone tracks, it's really just like a really sick mixtape or like an actual legitimate project, like an album of someone experimenting with all these genres. It feels very detached from being a soundtrack. It doesn't feel like it has a main theme, right? It doesn't have some like Legend of Zelda, Mario Brothers style, like iconic theme that most video games had at the time. It just is like an interesting collection of pop music at the time kind of melded together.
And there's some things that like there's a rock song. There's like a ska/rock song that is pretty good, about the city, by this group called the Reps. At least that's how they're credited on the album. But like, I can't find any information about them. Like, I'm guessing it was studio players or like some anonymous group who didn't want to be credited for working on a video game. But it slaps. It's a pretty upbeat song about, going around the city. And like, I mean, the lyrics, some people are speculating on YouTube that it's about Rudies, which are like Jamaican ska fans. It's like, well, maybe. Why don't we put a sample of that in? Yeah, that's about the city. Parenthesis B. Like, there's no way. It's too cool for the full word.
Yeah, we don't have time. We're going too fast.
But yeah, it's a fun rock song. Then we get like Electric Toothbrush by Toronto. Again, I can't find anything about that. And it's just this sort of like house music with like very heavily synthesized, great beat. And there's nothing about Toronto either. So who knows who is doing that? Just a lot of mystery with this album, which I didn't really expect. Because they have, of course, you can't have like a late 90s album that's going to appeal to the youth without Dragula from Rob Zombie. Like there's...
God damn it.
No, like there's one level.
I know.
So apparently, like I said, the game is set in Tokyo To, a mythical alternate version of Tokyo. But Sega demanded the game developers add in some American levels for the North American release. So they added Grind City, which was sort of a mix of Chicago and New York. And on that one level, on one of the two levels for Grind City, you could hear Dragula playing. And so, yeah, Dragula's not on every version of it, depending on what release you're going by. Like, there's a whole fan wiki for Jet Set Radio, and they have listings of like there's certain tracks for certain countries releases that weren't on others. Licensing, it's complicated. It has a little bit of everything.
It does. And it carried that really well. Like, we don't have to talk about it in as much detail, but I think a lot of that attitude carried well to the sequel as well, Jet Set Radio Future. I think they did a really good job. Well, they brought back the same composer, Hideki Naganuma. Yeah, he came back for the sequel and really nailed it again. And in some ways, the sequel soundtrack is almost, as a mixtape, even better because it's almost 2 hours, I think, of music versus 45-ish.
One of the things when you play the video game, you get the sense like, and when I read up about it, like the guy who was the producer, the leader for the team making this game, it was his first time as producer. Like, it was his first game under his name. So it was obviously, production was somewhat rushed because, you know, they had to get it. It was a release title for the Dreamcast, so they had to be ready by then. And the story is utterly nonsensical because they start with you like, you got to fight off all the gangs and take over Tokyo. And then like, oh no, here's this other plot coming in where you have to find bits of a record that can summon a devil. They were making it up as they went along. And like, the gameplay is pretty flawed in a lot of ways. It just feels like this rushed cycle. So like, I'm not surprised that when they had more time and money, you know, that they had more music to go along with it, because they realized the music was one of the strongest assets for the game.
Yeah, I didn't realize it was supposed to be a release title for the Dreamcast, because it came out, like, I thought a couple years after the Dreamcast. Like,
I thought it was one of the big ones. I'm let's see here. It was released in 2000. Well, I mean, we have the tag. So it's released in June 29, 2000. And the Dreamcast was released. Okay, so it was not. It was September. Yeah, it was a year afterwards. So I withdraw my comments. But yeah, there's 2 other tracks on the album I really want to talk about, or at least for Jet Set Radio. The first one is... Oh, yeah.
Is it Sweet Soul Brother?
It is Sweet Soul Brother.
Motherfucker.
Why don't you like...
God damn it.
Why don't you like...
I don't hate it. It's just that my friend played it like literally on repeat for hours on end.
Wow.
Like, if we were driving anywhere.
That one song on repeat?
Yeah. Yeah. He's a monster. I don't remember his last name, but Alan, if you're out there, you drove us crazy. Sweet Soul Brother.
I mean, I would hate the song too if I had to listen to it looping. It's probably the most joyous, like, happy song of the entire soundtrack. It's got this...
The little chorus stuff. It's so good.
And the electric organ, like the organ music in there. It's kind of got some sweet guitar riffs. It's and literally background sound effects of people cheering. It plays when you beat the game. Like, that's sort of your victory music. I mean, it plays throughout.
Okay.
Yeah. After you beat the last boss, you feel like, oh, thank God. Last boss is kind of a problem. It's kind of a bitch. You have to make very difficult jumps. Well, once you figure out the jumps, they aren't that difficult, but it's very frustrating. You're like, okay, what do I do? Okay. Fuck. But the other song I want to talk about is actually the final boss music, Grace and Glory, which also has this great opening with this weird unearthly chorus, and there's murmured voices, but then it segues into this really funky beat, just seamlessly. Here, why don't we just play a sample of that? I really like both those songs. I would put those in other mixes.
Oh, yeah.
And those are both Hideki Naganuma's as well. He really knows his stuff about music.
Yeah.
Were there any songs from the original soundtrack that you really liked?
I think we've covered them, honestly. Like, we have a fair amount of overlap in this regard. I remember a song, but I don't remember hearing it when I listened to the track, but there's another song that was always on repeat with Super Brothers. By Guitar Vader. God, that was like a rock soundtrack with like this weird, like almost like a Gorillaz track. I don't know why that wasn't on the OST compilation I found, but that's another song that's like just, I don't know if it's the best song or even like a particularly good song, but it is one that I have memories of that really just stuck in my head.
I'm looking at the soundtrack listing right now.
Yeah, me too. So it's one of these things where, there are various soundtracks by region, which is the way they did it. Like you said, they added Dragula to North America for those kids. They love their Dragula. So it could also be a thing that 20 years later, when these compilations get put out, that just it's hard to get all the rights back to those songs all over again because it was by kind of an external artist. So it could have just been, there, but then now it's gone because you can't license it for whatever reason.
I will link to the full OST that's on YouTube. One of the interesting things about Jet Set Radio, as we mentioned, sort of its legacy, and it's led to not only games, but actually a friend of the podcast, To Mello, created his tribute to Jet Set Radio, Memories of Tokyo To, which is a fun album. Any particular high notes from that album?
One thing I thought that was interesting is that it does do a really good job of like clearly being inspired by that style. And he's really good at pulling all those vibrant, like hip hop drum beats and samples together. But I thought there were some tracks that were interesting because it's not as constantly energetic.
Yeah.
And that's not like an insult. It's, I think, a function of being 18 years later, because it came out in like 2018 and just people's attitudes have changed. So, there's a track where one of the vocalists is sort of lamenting like, people find out I'm a rapper and they come up to me and they like, hey man, do a freestyle for us. And it's just tired of being harassed, man. Like there's this sort of like, it's just that modern attitude is hard to escape. Like all art, is produced in its time. And it's interesting how some of that modern malaise sort of has worked its way into something.
Yeah. That's a really good point. I did sort of like, it's not quite as energetic, but I think To Mello is smart because I think maybe that's probably why Big Beat sort of overstayed its welcome past 2001. Like there's something that kind of sucked the energy out of the room happening later in that year. And so people didn't want to hear the relentless optimism of Fatboy Slim after, our way of life was threatened by that. Yeah. So
there's a lot of touchstones talking not necessarily about the music, but the game itself, just stuff I found interesting on a broad level, just a product of its time, just to touch on some things. So we already talked about how it's like a product of this late 90s anti-establishment stuff, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like a Japanese Fight Club in a way, if you think of, I don't know if that's facile or whatever, but it channels that energy.
Well, I mean, they openly cite that an influence. I think that's a reasonable thing to say. But it's interesting because you're like still a member of your community, like fighting some oppressive regime, and like the police are literally the villains. It's not like you're some anti-hero criminal like Grand Theft Auto and you happen to fight the police. It's like the police are literally the arm of like a repressive corporate regime, which is interesting. It's interesting that you fight them with art through graffiti. I think it's part of the attitude people had towards graffiti at the time. Like, is it art or is it vandalism? The graffiti aspect, like you said, is novel in this game. But if I understand correctly, they actually pulled from real world graffiti artists for a lot of the designs. I think one of them is like the guy who did art for the Beastie Boys. Yeah. So circling back around into those hip hop things, and just in general, being a game that, so typically games are thought of as part of pop culture, right? Super Mario Brothers is part of 80s pop culture. But this is one of the first games, I think, that really goes the other way, where the game is engaging with the pop culture instead of being part of it. Like it's not, and without being like a movie tie-in or some franchise product like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, like that type of stuff. Yeah. I don't know why I picked that. That's the first one that popped in my head, but like that and like Trap of the Rapper are like, here are styles and art and concepts and themes that are relevant in pop culture to the kids playing our games. And we're going to put that back to them through the game instead of looking back on it 20 years later and being like, oh yeah, everybody played Donkey Kong. Everybody played Halo. Yeah. It's sort of interesting. It's to me kind of marks maybe the beginning of games going in that direction. Yeah. As like a tool for commentary. Yeah, they were, like I said, they had a vision. They wanted to say something, and they wanted not just to make a product that could be sold, but they actually did want to create art. Perhaps it's naive
I think that's a criticism of it. You know, it had this utopian vision, this idea that like tagging the cops and the gangsters, and once you defeat your enemies, they'll join your gang. So I love that trope of like, oh, you defeated me, so I'll join your side. Mm-hmm. You can unlock other characters, your enemies, and make them part of your gang. Yeah, I think that, it may be naive, but like, isn't that better than like what we got afterwards, which is just an endless stream of, military shooters and like licensed games and alien invasions and just like the others coming to kill you. Yeah,
exactly. I will absolutely take naive neon. This is genre, naive neon over the last 20 years of just brown and gray.
Yeah.
Quote realistic games. That's not to say that's all they produce, but that is the bulk of at least what the AAA market produces.
The game still looks good and still sounds good, like 20 years later. Like the PC port is flawed on a technical level, but like the actual game, like I still beat it. Like I wasn't so frustrated with it, I didn't put it down. Like there are parts of the game that are frustrating. There are jumps and other things that are frustrating, but like it was still fun to play. And like once you beat a level, you can go back in sort of a free play mode and just skate around, and that's where you can have some really fun, is just exploring that environment, like looking at the signs. Like there's so many references to Japanese pop culture and like American culture. Like there are enemies that are clearly taken from blaxploitation 70s movies. Like there's just a cornucopia of influences and styles, and both visually and musically. So it's actually fun.
Yeah, the game is great. You should play it if you can. The soundtrack is awesome.
Yeah.
You should listen to it. And you can. Both Radio and Future are just freely on YouTube for now. Tumella's inspired album is awesome. Definitely listen to it.
Yeah.
Yeah, they should make more games like it. They should bring it back.
Well, I know I'm going to be getting Bomb Rush Cyberpunk once it comes out. Actually, one thing I did find researching this is that fans of this, there's a lot of people who, like, this introduced whole new styles of music to a generation of gamers. Like, people like, they, play this game and they were just stunned that music could sound like this. It wasn't like, it's not like music it's not top 40 music. Like, it is fun and it's pop, but it's different. There's a website called jetsetradio.live, which we'll link, of course, in the show notes, that it'll play music that is clearly like, if you like Jet Set Radio, you will also probably like this. I listened to it a bit and it's like, yeah, no, so far so good. And so, yeah, there's still this community of people. It's like, well, if you like this music, well, you'll probably like this. So there's still that element of discovery out there. So I really like that. So I think that wraps up our discussion of Jet Set Radio. This is haunted music because, again, it's a future that never was, hint of a possibility where art is stronger than the police state. And if that's not haunted, I don't know what is. In our next episode, of course, the holidays are approaching us, so we'll have a Vaporwave Christmas episode.
I'm going to search also for non-Christmas Vaporwave, just holiday music in general. I'm curious what's out there.
Oh, I'm sure there's a lot. I do know one of the artists we're going to be looking at is Vacation Bible School, who is does a lot of Christian-themed Vaporwave, including, obviously, Christmas. And they're a very prolific artist. They've got like a dozen albums or something like that out there. But yeah, there's a lot out there. So it'll be a fun little holiday topic. Get your beeps and boops for the holidays. If you like this episode, please let us know. We are on Twitter, on Facebook, and of course, you can message us. I am at Ross Payton on Twitter. Burke is at Burke McBurkinson on Twitter. And of course, we are at Night Clerk Radio. We would definitely appreciate if you can rate and review us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, whatever podcasting app you use. Please let your friends and family, if you like this episode, know about it. We appreciate it. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next time.